Hello, everyone. I'm sure getting off the previous Zoom meetings or maybe a quick lunch if you're on the East Coast. And welcome to a very special edition of Accord's Masterclass series. We have three stellar CFOs joining us to help share their perspective on what's going on in finance world at the end of 2023, going into 24, and how to better build partnerships with your finance stakeholder. Really want to kind of flip the script from thinking about finance as kind of this potential blocker and more of a strategic partner, and understanding how they want you to engage with them, and kind of, having a bit of more, I think, positive, collaborative approach to that potential relationship. So really excited to, personally, I've spent my career in sales. I've never once had a conversation with a CFO not in a deal cycle. So this for me is going to be really, really interesting, and kind of this light bulb moment of like, how have I not been doing that? This is such a key stakeholder. I talk to all the other ones all the time, and this is like the key moment on every deal. And the only context I have is in those few opportunities. So hopefully we're going to get a really helpful perspective from Joe, from Melissa, and Pravir today. We're just going to launch a quick poll to start, which is, how often are you seeing finance come up in your deals? I'm going to really quickly, I don't even know if I can answer this, but this would be 75% plus. This would be 99% for Accord. And I doubt it's very different for other folks out there. But before we dive in, we really want this to be not just talking heads up here and collaborative with you. I know we're stuck on Zoom, unfortunately, and not all together in a room doing a fireside chat. So I'm going to ask everyone, if you go into your chat and you change the default from hosts and panelists to everyone, we're going to do a quick icebreaker, and we're going to go around the virtual room here and have everyone on the panel introduce themselves with where they're calling in from. And I think, Joe, you had the suggestion of what did you want to be when you grew up as a kid? So I'll start. So I'm Ross, CEO and founder of Accord. I'm calling in from Toronto, Canada. And what I wanted to be as a kid, I mean, I love sports. I was outside playing ball hockey or basketball or whatever it was every day. And I just wanted to be an athlete, which definitely did not come to fruition, I think, for a lot of reasons. But yeah, I wanted to be a basketball star, hockey star. And now I'm slinging SaaS software, but loving it. So that's myself. I'll pass it off to Melissa next to introduce yourself.
Thanks so much. So Melissa Howardson, I'm CFO at Vanna Solutions, which makes financial planning and analysis software and tools for finance teams. I'm calling in from Waterloo, Ontario today. And when I was growing up, I wanted to be a teacher, and somewhere along the way got convinced that if I like being with kids, make that more of a hobby or something you do that's not your work, and found my way down the finance path. I'll pass it over to Joe.
Hey, good to see everyone, or I guess good to meet everyone virtually. Joe Del Preto, CFO at Sprout Social. Sprout Social is a social media management platform. When I was, I'm coming from Chicago, Illinois, and grew up here in the suburbs and been in the city for a long time. When I was growing up, similar to you, Ross, I actually wanted to be a baseball player. Played a lot of baseball, played a bunch of different sports. Huge Cubs fan, used to go to a bunch of games, and wanted to be a baseball player, but that reality hit in, pretty quick. So on my way through finance along the way, a long way from being a pro athlete.
Totally. And to round it out, Pravir?
Yeah, I'll take us home. It's funny, we got a bunch of Canadian energy on here. I'm also from Toronto, but I live in Oakland right now. It's actually a picture of Game 7 at that when the Raptors were playing the Sixers a few years back. I'm the CFO at Figma. I have been there for about 6.5 years. Figma is an online interface design tool. We help product development teams build products together. When I was younger, my mom tells a story that I wanted to be a garbage man. Like, I used to go and stare at the window and kind of smile as they came by. But honestly, my dad sold dental supplies. I was always in like a family business. And so, I always thought I was going to do something, entrepreneurial in that way.
Awesome. Yeah, we got a lot of Canadian energy coming in, here, but, awesome. So before we get into the tips and tricks and talking about ROIs and total cost of and all that fun stuff, Melissa had a great suggestion of let's reset. Sellers and sales leaders and the revenue team, we have our perspective on what's happened, especially in the last 18, 12 months around the conversation, interest rates going up, harder to sell, more stakeholders, all that stuff. A good place to start probably is, what is the perspective? What is the point of view from the finance team of what's going on? Has it even changed? How does that affect them? And then we'll get into maybe the approach to build those partnerships. So I guess Melissa, I'll pass it back off to you, and maybe we can go kind of around just, what has the transition been from your perspective over the last, 18 months, what's going on with the economy and decisions in the office of the CFO?
Yeah, thanks so much. And I think, I even go back a little bit further when I sort of sit and reflect myself, how did I get here? How am I in more of the buying decisions? Whereas I wasn't a few years ago, have I changed the rules? Has the business changed the rules? Has something bigger happened here? And, and I think back even probably, I reflect back as far as COVID because it's still pretty fresh in our brains. We had 2020 come along. With COVID, things started changing and shifting a little bit, but quickly upon that, we got ourselves into 2021, 22. And I'd say at that time, money was flowing very freely, surprisingly to some, but there was lots of access to capital that we could all find. We had lots of companies that were really heavily focused on growth, some to the point of growth at all costs. And so it was about that. You had this war for talent that was happening within companies where how do we attract and retain the best talent? And we were all afraid that we were going to miss out on getting enough talent in-house. And so I'd say the way, with those dynamics that were going on, the way businesses were behaving was quite different than what's happened. If I think about then fast forward to 2023, the year that we're in, and even maybe late 2022, all of a sudden a few things really changed, I'd say rather quickly. The war for talent started easing. You started seeing access to cash starting to become more troubled. Companies can't just run out and get investment quite as easily as they could in the past. The things were starting to focus less on growth, although many companies still absolutely focused on growth, but a lot more focus on efficiency, profitability. Cash became king. And therefore, when companies talk about, hey, I have to be more efficient, I have to show a bigger ROI. Sure, we'll get into that later. A lot of that has come because of how much this macro around us all has changed. The cost of people is higher now than it was. And so we need to make sure, though, that as we look at cash profitability, growth prospects, that we're just adjusting the dials, I think, a little bit more evenly. And so focus on profitability inevitably became more prominent in 2023 than it did before. And I think as well, some of us in my seat found ourselves with post-COVID and coming out of those years with some commitments that were now dead money. We were spending money on things we'd committed to that now aren't giving us value. You think about, real estate that some of us had gone and locked into, or overbuying on tools that now, hey, if we're not going to grow employee headcount as much, maybe we don't need them. And so I think in many cases, then companies said as part of efficiency and some of the other themes, we need to also change the levels at which certain things need to be looked at in terms of those purchasing policies. And so if something looks or feels like this, it now needs an extra level of scrutiny, be it because of security, because of cost, because of how long the commitments are. And so I think that's where you start to see more finance teams, CFOs, and even other stakeholders like enterprise IT teams or security folks, or even boards of directors jumping on. It's a lot of some of these macro things that have changed. And also, I think the business strategies and where the focus are that are behind some of that.
For sure. Yeah. So what I'm, just to maybe summarize that, what I'm hearing is because of everything going on in the markets, the focus went from growth at all costs because you can always raise more money at a massive multiple. So it was very cheap to do that. Became around profitability because money got more expensive. We realized the decisions that we made in the past are going to have massive impacts on us in the very near future. And that's kind of what led to this like very immediate shift, right?
I think so.
And Ross, I think Piggybacking what Melissa said, which I 100% agree. I think part of that during that growth phase, and Melissa touched on this a little bit, is I think a lot of departments and groups, whether it was your engineering team, your infrastructure team, your sales team, your market team, kind of had free reign to kind of not only hire people, but bring in whatever tools they wanted, right? Like the number of different types of pieces of software that the different groups were buying was, there was all these companies starting up. There's all these really good point solutions all over the place. And so I think at the same time, not only were people hiring very aggressively, but there was not a lot of there weren't a lot of guardrails around the software being purchased across an organization. And so now I think what's happening on top of what Melissa was talking about is, what are all the tools we now have in-house? And so I think that's where the other level of scrutiny is now coming in, is kind of like taking inventory of the different pieces of software that we have across the organization. Because for a while there, it wasn't that tight.
Totally. And Pravir, does that map to what you're seeing? Any other kind of lenses that you think would be helpful to share?
Yeah, I mean, I think the only things that I would add, you kind of also have to think about like, how is your top line going to be impacted here? Like, I think everyone in their customer, and depending on who your customer base, you're kind of working with companies that were also going through changes as well, and you wanted to make sure that you were mapping the investment that you're making with the top line changes that you're seeing as well. And then I think there's kind of building on what Joe and Melissa were saying, if you kind of just look at the correlation in public markets between growth and efficiency, it's kind of the graphs have really changed and swung. And if I could kind of share, I don't know if I can screen share over here, but there is a really interesting chart that kind of shows that over time. And it's not necessarily, it kind of just displays how much of an aberration the couple of years were during the beginning parts of the pandemic. And it honestly now is just kind of like a resettling back to something that's a little bit more normal.
Totally. I think something that, and if you, feel free to pull up for a screen share if you can find that chart. But I think, oh, awesome, you have it right here. If you want to walk us through what this means for the non-finance folks here.
Pravir, I think you're muted.
Sorry.
There we go.
Yeah, so it kind of looks at like the correlation here between revenue growth and free cash flow margin as it relates to some of our public software companies out there. And you'll see during these periods of early COVID, growth was what was driving value more than anything, and that's what was getting rewarded in the public markets. We then started to see a lot of this kind of come back down to earth. And as a result, when you're looking at how companies are valued today, your free cash flow margin or your margin profile is playing that much more of a story here. And so that's kind of what this chart is meant to illustrate. I mean, we really were in these boom times over these years and kind of come back down to earth a little bit over here.
Totally. And I think something that you're pointing out is it's not just what's happening today, it's the delta between what we just went through and now. So I think a lot of people, it feels worse than it really is because of where you came from. And humans will adapt to whatever the new thing is. If this becomes the new thing, then it's the new thing. But where we just were, I think that makes it kind of extra challenging, because I think a couple of you already mentioned the tools that we had, it was so easy to get. So if we started from like a reasonable place and it went down slightly, like, oh, maybe it's like 20, 30% harder, but we went from like 300% easy to like slightly harder than normal. And I think that whiplash has left a lot of teams kind of questioning, how large does our sales team need to be? What is our cost of acquisition? How long would a normal contract be? Yeah, we got some 3-year, 5-year contracts pretty easily there. Is that market? Is that normal to do? So super helpful to hear. Yeah, any kind of final thoughts on the overall market stuff before we dive into the questions I'm sure the sales leaders are dying to hear?
I think we're good. I think that was a great summary, especially by Melissa there.
Awesome. So let's get right into the tactical stuff. I'll tee up an example. There's 100 different examples here. I know people from like service-based businesses, software, selling to enterprises, SMB, but like, let's just pick an example here. Let's say you have a piece of software that your engineering team uses, and they've been on, maybe it's a multi-year, 3-year deal for the last 3 years, and they spend $150K on it, and it's coming up for renewal. How do you, going into 24, how do you think about how you want that team to engage with you on that opportunity? Do you not want to talk to them and you just want to work with your team internally? Like, how, as a finance leader, is the ideal way of engaging with a potential vendor when you have this decision? I'm really curious, just like, before we get into the tips and tricks and the details, like, yeah, maybe go backwards, starting with Praveer and then Joe and then Melissa. Yeah, like, do you want to talk to them at all? Like, who on your team are you delegated to? Like, what kind of details? Like, I'm just curious, like, what's the best way to frame it up to you so they have the best chance of potentially adding value so you're not cutting the wrong thing in your stack?
Yeah, so for us, we spend a lot of our time, like say this vendor had been around for a while. As we walk into our 24 budgeting cycle, we've got folks on our finance team that are partnering with our engineering counterparts, and they're saying, okay, here's a list of all the key vendors that you have. Help us understand what you feel is really important and necessary as we work forward. And we have an envelope of spend that we expect that we've kind of aligned with them on. We as a finance org are generally pushing them to say, okay, what is the cost here ultimately being driven by? Is it driven by usage growth on our platform, number of employees, whatever it may be, and we back into what feels reasonable from a kind of year-over-year growth perspective. So like the way that we run it at Figma, not every time are you going to need to run not every time am I going to be expected to zero in there, because we've had these budget discussions on aggregate walking into the year. And so that would be my overall expectation. Now, should something be materially different, I think that's when we'll then introduce want someone on our finance team into part of that conversation to really understand what are the key drivers of why that should be any different than what either our run rate or whatever our expected growth would be. And my expectation would be, as we kind of jump into those conversations with the vendor, that we're able to work through the why behind it. And I'm able to have my champion on the engineering side kind of speak to me in the real terms of like, hey, does this make sense? Because we can't know everything about the technical solution, but we want to generally feel that we're brought along as part of the why behind there.
Got it. So maybe to replay that and kind of switch it into like what this means for a seller, it sounds like you're going to have a lot of context from that internal champion. Maybe in this case, it's probably, I'm guessing, like a VP of engineering at your level, maybe someone, other senior director that you might have a relationship with that's asking for this thing. Someone senior on the engineering team is where kind of ideally the sales team spend the time to help them really understand the why behind it, the value that they may be gotten over the last 3 years and what the future looks like. Like 80% of your 90% of your team's time spent there. And then maybe there's a conversation if something doesn't map perfectly with you to kind of fill in the last 10%. Does that sound right?
Yeah, that's kind of the exact way that we deal with it right now.
Awesome. Yeah, maybe we'll kind of go in a circle and see how common that is. And then there's a question that I see like the same question, like 9 different ways here, which we'll get into, which is like, how does ROI and the proof points, like getting to the details of that work. But Joe and then next Melissa, if you want to kind of share, what's the ideal way of working with you and your team on those kind of decisions?
Yeah, so we run a very similar process that Praveer does. We have there's folks on my team that are dedicated to the different business units. So in your scenario, like there'll be a finance business partner working with the engineering group, and very similar process. We've got a budget for each of the departments, and we'll have a very specific like non-FTE budget, which a big chunk of that for a lot of these groups is the software. And so we'll say, here's what you were spending in 2023, and now and when we go into 2024. Here's where, we believe your budget needs to be. And that's a combination of what they'll do is work with my team. Similar Praveer said, go software by software. What are you keeping? What are you getting rid of? And what are the new things you had? And so, and really what it is on the renewal side, very similar process. Like we also have a tool now that we rolled out not too long ago that actually gives us the usage of the different pieces of software that we found extremely valuable. So now we can go back into these into these groups and say, okay, you had 50 users, but only 25 of them were actually using the product. And so what we'll do is we'll coordinate that with what are the new softwares you want to buy. But in general, we give them a lot of free reign within the budget parameters. So if they stay within the budget that we've given them, like, yes, we are definitely going to make sure we're pushing them on the value of some of the new software, but we give them a lot of like their own decision-making process, as long as they're staying within the budget. We will get in this later, Ross, but when they want to go outside of the budget parameters and they're trying to make an argument for why they need something more than what we've allocated to them, that's where we get a little bit more into the details.
Totally. So you really inspect the usage And that's closely tied to the value, which is interesting because I think a lot of tools and a lot of sellers probably want to position it as the value that we provide might not be reflected in the fact that we have 70 versus 80 or 90% usage of it. It's probably on the outcomes, and kind of immediately making me think that you're almost devaluing your product if you purely tie it back to usage. But that's just kind of an interesting thing that kind of popped up in my mind.
So the key is, there's two things there. Is one is on the finance side. Remember, if the pricing is based on a per user basis, then the usage matters, right? Because the value
Yes,
can be really
that's
good.
what I mean. If you're per use, yes, exactly.
Yeah, so like it depends on how you're pricing your product, because you could still be getting really good value, but you can getting that value for half the amount of people because half the people didn't use it. And so you have to like balance that idea of like what's the actual pricing model from that vendor.
Totally. It's a really interesting point, Joe. And then to round us off, Melissa and others, feel free to jump in with maybe a quick answer. I know we have like 20 questions here. I get to like 5 more from the group. So if you have a quick thought or something, feel free to jump in on some of those questions. But Melissa, take it away.
Yeah, I largely agree. We do things very much like has already been described. The only thing I'd add is that I'd say the envelopes were in some cases either constrained or not growing as much as people had in the past, which has forced those conversations for, say, the engineering group to really look across their own tools and start to weight the relative value if they can't have all the things. I think the other thing that's happened is some companies were going for some pretty big price increases, which inevitably put pressure on that budget for that engineering team. If a few of your vendors were giving you, 10, 15%, well, now how are we going to fund it? And so it did make a more critical view, both in our seat, but also that engineering team to say, okay, what am I using the most? What is critical that I have to keep, which is starting to flush some of this stuff out. I do think, we still very much in finance want to empower those users ultimately to own their budget, make good decisions with their budget. We don't want to profess to know more or jump in and override. But we do need to get confidence that, hey, if we see usage isn't there, help us understand why this should still be used. And I think that then for salespeople, you touched on this, Ross, in terms of making sure you're getting ahead of, hey, did you know the value you've gotten from this tool has been this? The other thing I think is, as we've started looking at, the free-for-all of systems across the business, starting to take a more holistic view means you identify duplication in the system.
Yes.
And you're starting to broker conversations between engineering and another team who have something that looks the same to say, hey, if we could standardize on one of these things, that would be more efficient. And so, I think knowing that risk is happening in the system. The other thing is, if the system's been in a long time, I've seen this where sometimes there may be new functionality or other add-ons that aren't known by our user. And so something else in the system might look like it would be easier to standardize on or look like it does more. And so I do think those customer health checks, or making sure your customers are aware of not only what they've always been using, but latest and greatest, help you get ahead of a risk that can present without you knowing it, that it's still that thing they implemented 5 years ago because they haven't used some of your new functionality.
Totally. I think you're bringing up this other big point that I think every vendor partner out there has probably felt, is this push for consolidation, because obviously it makes more sense to use fewer things if they're overlapping the same, and there's been this big push, I think, from a product perspective too, of companies that have got a lot broader. And then I think it's hard, I'd imagine it would be hard for both the users as well as finance team to understand the truth behind that. Did you just make some acquisition or like bolt-on product thing that doesn't really drive the value, that feels like, you get the same value from it? Or, it's, I think just a really interesting point of what's going on in the market in terms of products. But the question that I think is on the top of everyone's mind, there's probably two. One is how and when to potentially engage with the CFO or the finance team. And then what does that look like in terms of the ROI? So let's shift gears to getting more tactical. Maybe we'll just go like a quick, couple sentence answer. What is the context that you would want to get involved in a deal cycle? Let's make this actually like a net new thing. Let's say the team, it's like mid-year, you don't have budget for it, but there's something that's been identified as critical to the strategic objectives of the business this year. how would you want that potential partner to engage with you? Maybe specifically like who would you want to engage with you? Is it the rep? Is it senior leadership? Who would you want to engage with you and how? And then as a follow on, we'll go back around and maybe talk about what can they arm you with in that conversation in terms of ROI, in terms of materials to effectively have that discussion. So maybe we'll bring it back around. Melissa, Joe, then Praveer. Yeah, when and how would you want and who would you want to engage with in that kind of strategic partner vendor conversation?
Yeah, so I think for me, that point of empowering the team who ultimately has to use the tools to be front and center, or whoever we put on negotiation, maybe that's with a procurement person. I would want them to be bringing me in alongside with the partner. I don't think it's normally wise to sort of jump over that person who's been put on point. But I do think understanding the process as you're starting to get close to, hey, we think we have a match, the earlier you can then say, well, who's involved and can I help you get in front of the finance team to show them the ROI, to help them understand what other customers are doing is better than waiting. Don't wait until the 11th hour when we feel like our back is against a wall and all of a sudden I have to sign this contract in 48 hours or the deal's off. You're worried that you're making a bad decision and something is just like your actual defenses come up that you feel like you want to slow this down and stop. So sooner is better for me. Joe?
Yeah, I would agree. Sooner is definitely better. The way I look at it is I really trust my team to bring me in when they need to bring me in. So I'm not out there trying to say, hey, I want to get involved in this buying process, Ross. And so there's very few times I will tell you outside of like if the finance team is going to buy a piece of software that costs a lot of money, then I'm definitely more involved, But when it's these other groups, I rarely have to get involved, I would say in general, because I trust my team that they've done the analysis and then they're going to present back to me internally on why we need this software. So like if you have a really good internal person that you're working with, Ross, at a company, they should hopefully be able to empower to go sell that internally. And that's the kind of the way I like to do it. So it's very rare that I get involved in meeting directly, for example, with a vendor in some other like piece of software. Like I don't think I've ever met with like someone on the engineering team and met with an engine, like one of the, the DevOps pieces of software that we met. Like if I'm in that meeting, it's like something maybe has probably gone wrong along the way internally at Sprout, not with what the vendor's selling. And so for me, it's more about when do they want to pull me in? And then I think when they want to pull me in, it's like, I really like a lot of the time, either CFO to CFO meeting or someone senior, and not on like trying to sell me on why I should buy or why my team should buy it, but more about like, hey, I'm going to be a really good partner for you. And I'm going to help you like when things are bad, you can call me. I prefer those types of conversations versus like going into a room and having someone try to tell me like what the ROI is and like convincing me in a meeting that, this is like some kind of math that's going to convince me of that. I don't know that's ever really worked with me.
So that has worked with me. And I maybe it's just my personality. And it could be just the cycles at which that I've lived through at Figma. So I started, we were about 25, 30 people, and there was no one else to talk to other than me. And so I'm the individual that's going and asking these questions. So I guess maybe as time has progressed, I've been able to defer more to my team, but you are going to have that conversation with someone, I believe. So and I believe there's a conversation around a spreadsheet. I believe that there's and that's my love language. That's the way that I would expect my finance team to be able to engage. And I think that I would also want them to have the ability to go back and forth to understand, okay, well, what is the other suite of solutions that we would have considered? What are the customer case studies that give us confidence here? And as those boxes are checked and we can feel really good and confident that we're making a good decision, and I really do think about them as checkbox decisions along the way there, that then makes my job at the end of the day that much simpler. And I think to where Melissa and Joe were going, we don't want to be surprised. We want to be brought in early. And I think our teams can help us there by giving us a little bit of heads up through this buying process. And my expectation is you are going to have some amount of back and forth and requirement for someone to be able to speak to the investment and the rationale as to why. But that may not always, depending on the stage of the company, be the CFO, but it could likely be someone else within the org.
Totally. But what I'm hearing, and correct me if I'm wrong, is that still, even though the CFO needs sign off, you're still relying on and deferring to that organizational leader. And maybe we're conflating that sign off with maybe more work to do with that organizational leader to be more of a champion. And we feel like we may be losing deals to the CFO, but we really just don't have the right conviction with that VP of engineering or VP of sales. Does that feel right? That's kind of what I'm hearing. It's still not like we're not taking this into our hands. We're still relying on the group. There's tighter budgets, but yeah.
I think there's two dynamics, and Pravir hit on this earlier. One is like, I'm going to rely heavily on my finance business partner on my team that's been coordinating with engineering, right? Like if I'm going to need their vote of confidence, even before I even take a look at it. And then number two is there's certain folks across the organization that I've worked with that I know when they're coming to me with something that I have a certain level of trust with. So it's really important to understand, like if the senior person you're working with, or the subject, whoever you're working with on your team, Ross, whoever they're working with at, for example, at Sprout, that person's like internal kind of reputation and ability to get, like, that's a real thing, right? Like there's a certain level of trust I have with certain leaders where I'm willing to take a little bit more risk or a leap of faith given their track record, versus others that I know I'm like, okay, I got to really dig in with this person because historically they've not done a great job. And so there's those internal dynamics that I know are hard for you to assess on your end.
Yeah. The one kind of anecdote there is like, if you're replacing another solution, it probably means that something else didn't work for some reason. And so those are the ones I dig in on. It's like, why do you believe this one is going to be different? And help me understand that and what diligence you've done that's different here. Because those are the ones that perk my ears up.
Yeah. Marketing is ripe for those conversations.
Absolutely.
Melissa, is that, so it sounds like depending on the scale of the company too, there might be a finance partner that works at that head of role level or organizational level, then bubble up to yourself.
Yeah, and I think that's the importance. Understand the company and how it works on the other side. If procurement reports into finance, you're probably going to have a finance person who's more directly involved in deals than if it sits outside of and finance is just signing it. So I think, understand those dynamics. The business partnership that Joe talked about as well, understand that maybe there's a finance business partner that works with that engineering person to help them make their business cases. Well, if they think they'd want to bring that person into the conversations to help get conviction, test the model, make sure that the ROI that you've all come up with is valid, by the time it comes to us, then it just makes it that much easier to feel confident that, hey, we're not about to make a mistake and this is like funny ROI rather than one that, our finance teams, because my finance people are also on board that the ROI is there. Well, now I'm also signing up for that ROI in finance to be true. So it really depends on the company you're dealing with, but understand how they work.
Totally. So we're getting into, I feel like we're getting into acronym land, ROI, total cost of inaction, all this stuff. So, and it sounds like we're going to have some differing of opinions in this group, which is awesome because there's no sales, unfortunately. So you get paid the big bucks. There's no right answer. It's both an art and a science. So maybe going back around, what does that mean to you, right? Let's go back to this example. Let's say it's a net new purchase and the organizational leader is sponsoring it, right? You have someone that you relatively trust and they're saying, hey, you know how we're focused on, I don't know, engineering productivity, like fill in the blanks for the organization, productivity and efficiency. We've been, talking to this group for the last 3 to 6 months. It really feels like we did the small POC. We validated the technical part of it. It really feels like there's something to be had here, but we didn't have it in the budget, right? Like we went into 2024, it's now Q2. How do we think about this decision? We kind of did an ROI, like, what do you want to see that's going to help you feel comfortable or not in that decision? Is it just that leader just, banging on your door being like, this is the absolute game changer? You know how we said we need to do this year? Like it's worth the 100K. What do you want to see in terms of numbers, in terms of the people internally to have enough conviction to spend that money, especially if it wasn't previously budgeted? Maybe we'll go. Yeah, Joe, if you want to jump in, I just saw you unmute yourself, so if you want to dive in.
Yeah, so I think it varies depending on what part of the organization, what type of software you're buying. For example, if I'm buying like a piece of cybersecurity software for my security team, like I'm not necessarily doing an ROI analysis. It's more like, hey, here's the risks we're trying to avoid and whatnot. But let's just put that aside because we're talking to people probably that are more on the sales and marketing, type of.
Yeah, let's say it's discretionary. It's not like your company would literally shut down tomorrow if the thing wasn't there. This is more of cost savings potential or accelerated revenue potential.
So there's a couple of things that I'm always looking at. One is like, what's the productivity of the efficiency gains we're going to get from that? And the way that this just has come up recently, it's like, okay, the sales team comes in and says, hey, we want, and we're always trying to put these two things together. Okay, we want these 3 tools or these 2 tools, and here's what they think they're going to do for the company. And then I go look and say, okay, well, what's your business plan, your revenue plan? This is going to drive this much productivity increase. This is going to drive this much efficiency. And then they send over their plan and they've got productivity flat year over year. It's like, okay, wait a second. So for me, I'm always trying to look like, what's the actual outcome here? And does that actually tie back to the targets and the goals and the things you're trying to set internally at the organization? If those things are disconnected, that's like, okay, well, what really are we trying to do here?
That is a great point. I think we recently, for our interviews for AEs, have been doing case studies, and I've been like CEO, CFO. And the way I think about it is like, didn't we hire this person or this group of people to make these investments already to hit these numbers? So if these numbers don't change, why are we spending could our team just not do their job? And then are we just spending $100K because our team can't do the job that they signed up for? So I think you hit a great point where in the business case, you kind of need to go to that organizational leader, whoever owns that OKR, to say, we're going to need, we're willing to sign up for one less head. We're actually willing to have one less person on our team to pay for this thing, or we're willing to have more revenue or increase our, right? Is that what you're kind of saying? That would help you feel really confident about the decision?
Exactly, Ross. That's the thought process we're going through. Is like, I think the trickiest thing sometimes for organizations is they want to spend the money, but they don't want to commit to like what that actually, like they don't want to commit to the other side, right?
Yeah.
No,
it makes a ton of sense.
I need your commitment. You're going to drive, 5%, 10%, whatever that is. Cause
the piece I'd add is like, we really dig in on like, help us understand the problem, and like help us feel really bought in that this is a challenge that we can overcome in some way. And so if it's like a rep productivity issue, like help me really understand what particular segments, what challenges you're having, help me build a little bit of empathy for where you're going. And I think like where Joe is going is kind of where we are as an organization right now. I think we think about both the dollars that we're spending both on headcount and external spend. It's somewhat like fungible there. I think it's just it's a better way to run the efficiency of your business if you can get there. And so it's seeking out the trade-offs if you can get them. As you increase your external spend side with savings on the headcount side, are trade-offs that we want to be able to make better. We want to make more easier for people to do. But it's something that we're growing into. It's not something that we've always had over the years.
Totally. Yeah, it's hard to quantify. I mean, on top of their day jobs too, if someone's working on this thing and they find something like, I'm going to spend another week, and that's where sellers out there that are listening, like, help your buyers do this job. Like all the stuff we're talking about, there's a lot of work is what I'm hearing for the organizational leader. And you're probably not even talking to that SVP of sales and marketing. You're probably talking to someone who reports to them. So like, you have a lot of work to do to build all of this stuff. Go out there, talk to a bunch of stakeholders, understand the business better than they do, work with that maybe director, VP level person to bring it up to the, C level in that team. Then who's going to need to bring it to Praveer, Joe, or Melissa and convince them that this is going to have a material impact on those OKRs and be worth the change management and all that stuff. So it's a lot of work to get those deals done today. But from what I'm hearing is it's not impossible. It's just the bar is higher for the level of conviction you need to have.
I totally agree. And I think about the person you're selling to. In the past, if they were hiring a lot of people, they could maybe sign up to the ROI because, hey, I won't hire so-and-so down the road. But now when hiring is not as rapid, it's actually, hey, am I willing to sign up for reducing headcount or keeping flat? Which if you're that person signing up to that improvement, it takes a little bit more conviction at that moment to know that you can actually live without it. So I think the more that the vendor can help convince you, whether it's, hey, we've got large data pools and X% of our customers experience X%. And if you see that it's big enough, it's not one customer that saved this, but you start to get confidence that, okay, I'd be willing to sign up for an outcome relative to this software because I believe that it's easy enough to achieve it. So the bar has just raised on all of this.
Totally. I'm seeing a few really great questions here to wrap up. I can't believe where the last 40 minutes went. We got about 5 more minutes, so maybe we'll do quick hits, and maybe I'll just ask like individual people here so we can go through some of these questions. Maybe just starting with what I just saw here. What are the chances, Joe, I'll go back to you. What are the chances of getting a deal done at your company if the sales rep is not talking to a senior leader, an executive, they're talking to a frontline manager or maybe a manager of managers and you're at a larger business? Is that enough to unlock budget, or are they going to need to convince first that organizational leader?
So two quick things. One is it depends on how much you're spending, right? There's certain dollar thresholds, for example, at Sprout, where if they're working with the finance business partner, it doesn't need to go up the chain. And I think that's different for every company. So I think it's good to ask when you're in those deals, Ross, like what's the dollar amount here that's going to require it to go to the next level up? So it's all based on dollar level, and then it's based on whether or not, the business partner is in there. If you check those 2 boxes, then you have a high chance of getting that deal done.
Awesome. For Veer, because you sounded like, you said your love language is spreadsheets. What is the ROI model that you want to see? A lot of people are talking about what's the return. A lot of people are talking about actually what's the cost of inaction if you don't change. This is what it's costing you today. This is what it would be if you did. Roughly, what is the math that you would be doing, and then ideally the vendor's doing for you to make those decisions?
Yeah, there's not necessarily like a threshold or percentage or like I need it to pay back in
5x or whatever. Oh, yeah.
Like that's not the math that I'm doing. I'm honestly just looking at like what's the status quo, what's the problem that we have, what does the new solution kind of get us, and typically if it's a net positive, we can get there, and then we'll push on price a little bit to get us a little bit more.
Totally. And then Melissa, I'm loving these rapid fire questions. There's so many to pick from here. I guess a good question at your level is, where was this question? Sorry. Which risks are CFOs willing to take in 2024? Like when you're looking at which things are you open to making bets on in terms of investments and spend? So when maybe you see something come across your desk, and like we already just said, like, no surprise, like security companies are doing really well still because it feels like CFOs are not willing to make the cybersecurity risk, but they're willing to make that investment, but not others. Like what kind of things, maybe just whatever pops to your head, do you feel like are things that you're not willing to take the risk on and you're willing to take the risk on from a budget perspective?
Yeah, I think aligning it with your top strategic imperatives as a business. So things like security are top of mind at lots of companies. I'd say artificial intelligence is another one that there's not as much history to prove. So we're all needing to take a bit more leap of faith when it comes to AI. And I think, any that are tied to efficiency, it might be a risk, but as long as you can see a path that seems viable there, I think those ones manage to get through.
Totally. So more about cost savings and efficiency than growth, not surprising there. Praveer, what about you? What are areas in the business you feel like just kind of scream, this makes sense to do versus like, we got this ask from this department or for this initiative, and like, that's not going to happen in 24.
I wouldn't downplay the growth aspect. Like, yes, the trade-off has been more lean towards efficiency, but like, I mean, take Figma as an example. We're still very much like in our upward growth cadence, and I'm looking for ways to supercharge and reinvest in the business. And so, if you can tell that story too, I'm super pumped and excited to engage. I think an interesting note to kind of build on where Melissa was going, at our board meeting this past week, like one of our directors were saying that every single CIO and IT leader is going to have to think about how they're going to spend for Copilot next year, and like these are the types of trends that our CFO is spending time on and thinking about. And as we're having to lay out our budgets for next year, that some of the incremental dollars are going there. And so the bar gets raised a little bit because you're now competing with a set of solutions that you just need to figure out like how they play well. So I just think that we just have to be a little bit more thoughtful in the bets that we make, because we also know that some of our budget's going to have to go to experimenting with these new features too.
That's super helpful. And Joe, to round us up, maybe super high level, the partnership between these two companies, especially if these are larger budget items, how do you want someone to kind of keep you updated? Obviously, you might not be joining every weekly meeting or even executive business reviews. What's a good way, again, like just kind of super high level, that you want to be engaged? It sounds like maybe having an executive on the other team. What's a way for people to think about just building that really strong relationship and partnership?
Yeah, Ross, for me, I really do like the CFO to CFO or someone senior on the team, just so there's someone to communicate when something, is going, wrong, or there's an issue, or it's renewal time. Just having that kind of relationship or that cadence, I think, is just really important, because you can have just a real, like, honest conversation about what's going on. And I think you get cut through all the other stuff. And I've always appreciated that.
Awesome. Well, there's a zero cost of acquisition thing to change in your sales process, the renewal process. If you're not doing that, make sure that you're bugging your executives to get involved. And I mean, it means a lot to be spending money today. And if you're above the budget line, you should probably be investing in those partnerships. So I know we're like 30 seconds over, but thank you so much for everyone that dialed in. Huge thank you to Melissa, Praveer, Joe for investing in the community, trying to kind of build better partnerships between companies. Yeah, tough times for everyone out there. Y'all need to cut budgets and make your companies efficient. Salespeople need to get paid and make sure they still have a job. So hopefully kind of the more collaborative approach and understanding what both teams need is kind of net positive out there. So thanks so much for everyone for tuning in.
Thanks, Ross. Appreciate it.
Thank you.
For having us.